I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Janelle Wong. Janelle Wong is a board member of the newly launched AAPI Victory Alliance and a professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland. Janelle joins me to discuss the most recent data around anti-Asian incidents and hate crimes, particularly how those data have changed during the pandemic. We also dig into the data around gender differences in relation to anti-Asian hate incidents, primarily around how Asian American women report these incidents when compared to how men report similar incidents. Lastly, we talk about the legislative goals of the AAPI Victory Alliance and how they plan to build their organizing power to address many of the findings from the data we discuss in this episode. So here is my conversation with Janelle Wong. Janelle Wong, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to talk about the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents that we've seen. The recent data that I've seen shows that during the year of the pandemic, I think this was, the data was taken between, March of last year and February of this year. There have been, nearly 4,000 incidents of hate crimes, at least reported hate crimes, in comparison to the previous year, where there were, 2,600 for the entire year. I don't know if those numbers are correct, but that seems like a significant rise.
Yeah, since the start of the pandemic, we have definitely seen from different sources that there has been an increase in reported incidents with racial bias against Asian Americans.
But there's also a difference in gender, right? In the way that women experience these hate crimes and incidents versus the way that men are experiencing them. And I wanted you to parse through some of that data for me, because one of the things that I had read, and this is probably wrong, and I think there's this gulf in how the media is reporting this incident and what the data actually says. But is it or is it not true that women are experiencing, or at least they're reporting, more incidents than men? Can you help me parse that data?
Sure. Yeah, this is, I think, an important point in the current moment of how we understand both race and gender and the violence that is associated with both. So we know that the Atlanta shootings in March, that was, a white gunman who opened fire on an Asian-owned spa or Asian-owned spas, and that violence was for sure a function of both race, the women's national origin, and gender. Those women were in that position because of their gendered, occupations, and they were also economically vulnerable. What we're seeing in the reporting to especially hotlines like Stop AAPI Hate is that women are much more likely than men to report incidents of potential racial bias to those hotlines. So about 70% of those reporting to that hotline are, in fact, women. In other kinds of data collection, like surveys actually ask people broadly whether or not they've experienced an incident, and people who have not experienced those incidents are also included in that research. And what we see in survey data is slightly different. We see that both Asian American men and women report similar levels of hate crimes and racialized attacks and other kinds of things like property damage. But in some surveys, men are actually reporting a little bit higher levels of that kind of experience. What really comes through in these data, and something that I think is common across all of the different kinds of ways people can collect data, is that the way that Asian American women experience violence is quite different from the way that men do. So we also ask, what do you attribute to this attack or this incident or this hate crime experience? And women are much more likely to name both gender and race as potential motivations. In addition, what we see is that women are much more worried than men about racialized violence. And we see that women are more likely than Asian American men to say that they are reluctant to report a hate crime to law enforcement. So that's why these community hotlines are so important, because they provide an alternative to law enforcement for reporting. At the same time, we need to understand that, sometimes there are differences in the population about who is going to be more comfortable or motivated to report to a hotline in the first place.
Right. That makes sense to me. So it sounds like Asian American women have the same experience around how they perceive an attack being gender-based that a lot of women do, because a lot of women, I think, experience violence differently because it's typically gendered, right? Gendered violence. So that would make sense to me. I guess what I don't understand, you can help me, is What is the difference in reporting to a hotline versus law enforcement? Are there data to suggest, why women are less likely to go to law enforcement? And is the same reluctance there for men?
Yeah, we also looked at that, and there are some differences. So the issues have to do with whether or not women versus men believe that real action will be taken. And so that's part of the explanation. In addition, there are fears that there will be either another attack if women report to law enforcement, or that there's levels of this for men too, but it's higher for women, or that their family will come under scrutiny. And so these are kind of gendered experiences more broadly in society, and also affect reporting to law enforcement. And maybe women, we haven't done a deep dive into this, but maybe women feel more comfortable then, or have more awareness for some reason, of a kind of community-based hotline.
I guess what I was trying to say was that I think men generally, regardless of race, men generally never report crimes against them, or rarely report crimes against them as a gendered crime, right? Because, crimes against men don't really have that kind of element to it, And women generally, regardless of their race, it's typically or often a gendered crime, like sexual assault or, that kind of thing. So that doesn't necessarily surprise me. And I was just wondering if there's something more significant in the data around, anti-Asian hate crimes, right, with women specifically, because I know that the Atlanta shooter, it was a gendered crime, right? And it was, he was just charged with a hate crime the other day.
You will notice in coverage of that, of the charges, that the Atlanta shooter, it's based on both race and gender. So the prosecutor actually mentions gender as one of the specific reasons a hate crime is being evoked here.
Yeah, so the Atlanta shooter, spa shooter, I remember when reports were coming out soon after the shooting happened, there was a debate online about whether this was actually a hate crime or not because of his stated motive. But I think that speaks to kind of the oversimplification of crimes like this. I was thinking about Kate Mann's book, Down Girl, and how people misconstrue what misogyny actually means. It isn't just kind of an oversimplified hatred of women, but it looks different in a lot of, in a lot of circumstances, in a lot of contexts, right? And, clearly hate crime is the right crime for him to be charged with in this case.
Yeah, I think that it is very complicated. And I think there are really important reasons to think about this moment of anti-Asian violence in connection to what is a long history of racialized violence in this country. So before I get to that, I think it is important to say that the hate crime charges that have been brought against the Atlanta shooter do also charge with as a gendered hate crime. So I really credit organizations on the ground in Atlanta for pushing the intersectional analysis of that horrific incident, that it was both racialized violence and gendered violence. And it also had to do with economic vulnerabilities. And, I think that kind of different from the past, there are these more robust organizational efforts to shape this more complex narrative around this kind of violence. The other thing that is really critical is that, our data show that Asian Americans are not alone in experiencing racialized violence in this moment. And so the group that's most likely to report a hate crime are Black Americans. And that should be no surprise in some ways, given, the history of this country and the ways in which violence has been used against Black Americans. So what we see is that Black Americans are more likely to report a hate crime. That means that, all groups of color are actually reporting upwards of 30 to 40% having experienced a hate crime over the course of their life. But we also see that in 2021, just the first few months of this year, we have seen a convergence of the levels of hate crime. So all groups of color are actually reporting about 10% of those groups are experiencing hate crimes. And, I think it's important for just the overall understanding of what's happening right now is that these incidents against Asian Americans are happening in this much broader context of racialized violence. We need to, I think, respond in a way that addresses both anti-Asian sentiment the gendered aspects of that, but also addresses racialized violence more generally. And so it's not, lost on many people that this violence is unfolding at the exact same time that we're seeing the trial around George Floyd's murder, and that, incident after incident of police violence is occurring. And our data also speak to that. So we see that racism works very differently across different communities. And while Asian Americans were the most likely to report microaggressions steeped in long histories, related to being assumed to be a foreigner or not speaking English, that Black Americans were more likely to experience police misconduct or to have a teacher, for instance, discourage them from continuing their education. On the other hand, Asian Americans were the least likely racial group to experience that kind of bias in society.
Right. I found that really interesting. And actually, I'll put a link to the data in the show notes, because I think some of the data that you parse out, you show that, like you said, like with police violence, I think Asian Americans were less likely to report incidents with police interactions versus, African Americans, Black Americans, and Latino Americans. So it's really interesting data to kind of look through and see the differences in how people experience, generally like racism in this country.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I think is also important in terms of the narrative of this moment, that Asian Americans are experiencing high levels of street violence that's happening actually across communities of color to some extent, not getting as much attention, but that Asian Americans are also not facing certain kinds of discrimination that have been really endemic in this country. And so I think it's really an important conversation for Asian Americans to have ourselves, which is, what is our role in confronting this kind of violence? What are we going to do to kind of both, defend our own communities, but also defend other communities who are experiencing very similar and sometimes much more intense forms of racial discrimination, racialized violence.
Yeah. And you remind me of another piece of data that was there around housing. Like Asian Americans experience less, or they reported experiencing less bias in housing, like seeking, mortgages for housing versus other groups, other ethnic groups in the data.
Yeah, there's this long history of racial segregation in the US. And that is why I think understanding that history and how we all got to be where we are in this kind of terrible moment is so critical. So our data show that while all groups experience some degree of housing discrimination, that Asian Americans experience far less than other groups. And that, that just contributes to the structural inequalities that really plague our nation. And so Asian Americans, in some of these areas, while racialized, don't experience the same degree of really structural blocks that other groups do. And it's interesting. We actually disaggregated our Asian American sample so that we can see, are some groups faring worse than others when it comes to, let's say, a landlord or renter refusing to sell or rent to you. And there's, even when we do that, while there are variations among Asian Americans are still far less likely to face that kind of housing discrimination compared to Black, Latinx, and even Native Americans and Pacific Islanders to some extent.
Yeah, one of the pieces of data that I wanted to point out, related to the pandemic was the fact that I think people understand by now that women generally across all racial groups have experienced the economic fallout from the pandemic more than men, right? But Asian American women, they're in certain fields that were hit hardest during the pandemic. That I think the unemployment rates for Asian American women or Asian Americans generally is doubled what it is normally.
That's right. There had been this kind of moment of interesting convergence where Asian American and white Americans were showing a lot of parity in economic indicators, employment rates, occupational security, mobility. And then the pandemic hit, and we really saw a kind of breaking away again of Asian workers versus white workers. And that isn't to say, I think it is still the case, and this is important, that Black, Latinx, Native workers have been hit much harder than Asian Americans. But we're starting to see this gap between white and Asian workers. And that is partly a function of the major economic polarization within the Asian American community. So while Asian Americans as a whole are more economically secure in some ways in terms of income, in some terms of education than white workers. We also see that within the Asian American community, and this was so underscored by the Atlanta shooting, that there are major swaths of economic insecurity and vulnerability. And so, that's why we see that the Asian American poverty rate is higher than the white poverty rate. And those things can exist simultaneously, right? There's sort of great advantage in certain sectors of our economy for Asian American workers. And there are also these real persistent inequalities. And that's why we see so many Asian American workers, and as you say, women who are working on the front lines, who are working throughout the pandemic in close contact with other people. And so, there's these complexities to the community that are really papered over if we just look at aggregate statistics. One of the things that, I think our research really helps to elucidate is that even though the initial blame for the pandemic was really focused on China, and the terminology around it by President Trump and others were focused on China, the scapegoating did not just affect Chinese in the US. And so this is a way in which we can understand, I think, how the Asian American community is constructed. We are kind of tied together by these shared experiences of racism and scapegoating. And so right after the pandemic started and those terms started to be used, we had done a survey, and it showed that Indian Americans were the most worried about COVID-related harassment, hate crimes. And that makes sense, right? After 9/11, then many South Asian Americans were attacked, were subject to the same kind of charges of being disloyal, of being foreign, because of mainly Islamophobia. And so there's this intimacy with the South Asian population related to kind of foreign policy and how it can affect the Asian American community. And then what we saw after, as the pandemic rolled on, is that many Asian Americans outside of the Chinese American community have been subject to various kinds of hostilities. And that ranges from people who are Southeast Asian, Vietnamese, Cambodian. One of the most horrific attacks was a Burmese family in Texas. And so, I think this is also not only a kind of recognition that people have about the long history and current manifestation of anti-Asian violence in the US, but also how it affects all Asian Americans, partly because this is still the case that people don't make those distinctions between different Asian national origin groups. And while that can be problematic, it is also a basis for solidarity.
Right. I think what I'm hearing is, I think we all understand that all non-white groups, all racial groups in America were, targets due to the last administration's rhetoric, right? Beginning with the campaign. The pandemic exacerbated that. But I think the thing that's surprising to me is that, specifically due to the pandemic, there was lots of terms used to, put the focus on, Asian Americans. But all racial groups experienced an uptick in violence and reports of hate crimes after the pandemic. Although, the last administration specifically targeted Asian Americans or pointed the finger at Asian Americans. And I don't really know if I understand that, if they were just it's just generally racism in America. Any ethnic group, any non-white group was going to be a target just because that was just the nature of the administration. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, so anti-Asian violence is pretty cyclical. It is both cyclical in the attention it gets and its level, but there's an undercurrent of anti-Asian violence that is kind of always there. So our survey data show that even before the pandemic, there were, pretty steady, the levels of reported discrimination have been pretty steady over the course of the pandemic. We haven't seen an uptick in the last 3 months of actual experiences necessarily. But what we do see is the kind of racial tensions and racial blame that occurred over, the last presidential administration did, as you say, affect all groups in different ways. And so while media attention is on anti-Asian violence to some extent now, we also see this real kind of backlash to Black Lives Matter and many incidents of more state-sanctioned killing. So police officers, there's still obviously an endemic problem with police violence against especially Black communities, including Black women. And more recently, I've been thinking, partly why Asian Americans have been targeted is because of their racial status, but also because of their immigrant status, right? Because these are kind of vulnerable communities when you think about people who are immigrant workers on the front lines, immigrants who are, shop owners and whose businesses are being vandalized. And that is something that really does tie in, I think, to the more anti-immigrant rhetoric that was issued by Trump. And, I'll just put in a plug for one of the hats I wear, which is the AAPI Victory Alliance. We are a group that really has tried to both lift up these Asian American experiences and attention to the discrimination Asian Americans face, and really try to push towards political representation as a potential answer. And that also means working with other non-white groups, because as you can see from these data, the kind of experiences we have are both very connected, but manifest themselves in different ways.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned the Victory Alliance, because I'm curious about, what your goal is if you're thinking about, coming up with a set of policy proposals. I know that the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act just passed, right? Just passed through Congress. But what is the focus? What are the goals for the Victory Alliance in relation to legislation?
Yeah, so there's the Victory Alliance is really focused on having an influence on the policy debate. And that means bringing the kind of data that I discussed, which is really not, that data is from another organization I work with called AAPI Data in conjunction with SurveyMonkey. But the Victory Alliance is made up of people who were very deeply involved in the White House initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during the Obama administration, who continue to have a deep interest in public policy, but are looking for ways to kind of consolidate some issue priorities. And so one of the things that I think is not being talked about as much today, but I think is still critical for understanding the future, is that while Asian Americans are so internally different, and that is one of the hallmarks of the community, this kind of internal diversity, there are some real experiences that hold them together. And one of those is discrimination. But there are also policy views that really distinguish Asian Americans from other Americans. And those are sometimes surprising to people. So Asian Americans are more likely to have supported the ACA, or what's commonly called Obamacare, than the rest of the U.S. They are more pro-gun control than the U.S. population more generally. And they are more likely to call themselves environmentalists and support government regulation to address climate change. And maybe most surprisingly, they are very strongly in support of taxing the rich to provide a middle-class tax cut. And so even though we have this really diverse community with people having so many different cultural backgrounds, histories, and languages, there are still some ways in which we're starting to see a kind of progressive Asian American agenda develop. And that's what the Victory Alliance is intent on lifting up.
Is there more room for, a multiracial coalition, right? Because these are issues that intersect across a lot of different races we've talked about, right?
Yeah, that's really what I think most of our data and research points to, is that Asian Americans are still 4% of the US electorate, right? We cannot go it alone. And we have quite a kind of robust set of overlapping interests with other people of color and other progressive groups in some ways. And so you see this potential for a very strong role for Asian Americans in the broader multiracial coalition. But it's really, I think, also up to Asian Americans to step up, to be in solidarity across these different issues. And so not just getting active when the violence is seen to be attached to us, but also to get involved in so many of these other areas where we are, we are also touched by the discrimination that so many other communities experience. And so I think you have it exactly right, that there's a way in which this current moment is pointing towards multiracial coalition building. And in fact, there's no way forward without it, because we certainly can't go it alone, in the kind of demographic position we're in, and even in the kind of racial position that we occupy in this country. It's super complex, but we have to find a way forward.
Well, Janelle Wong, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you so much for pulling this data together. I'll include all of the notes and in the show notes, or the links in the show notes to the data. But thank you so much for all of your work.
Really appreciate the time.